The photograph was found in a drawer beneath 16 years of yellowed letters, insurance policies, and moth-eaten cloth. Nothing exceptional, except for the moment Mary Holbrook held it to the lamplight and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was her grandfather, holding a child. The year 1903, written in faded pencil on the back. The child's face was turned slightly toward the camera, eyes wide, mouth neither smiling nor frowning, just staring with the eerie stillness that old photographs always seem to carry. But when Mary turned toward the hallway mirror to steady herself, she saw it. The child in the photograph looked nothing like the child her grandfather had raised. Nothing like the daughter he had buried. Nothing like the face that had appeared in every family portrait from that time forward. It was May of 2019, in a small house outside Binghamton, New York, where the Holbrook estate was finally being cleared after the death of Mary's mother. The attic had surrendered boxes of documents spanning a century, birth certificates, land deeds, receipts for livestock and grain. And now this, a photograph that should not exist. Mary sat on the floor, the picture trembling in her hands, and asked the question aloud to no one. Who is this child? The only answer was the hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. We dig into the stories history tried to erase, the ones that don't let go even after a century. If that's what you're here for, stay with us. To understand what Mary Holbrook had discovered, one must first understand the architecture of silence that families build around shame. The Holbrooks were not wealthy, but they were respectable. Farmers, school teachers, deacons. The kind of family whose name appeared in town records but never in scandal. They attended church every Sunday, paid their debts on time, and buried their dead with hymns and dignity. But silence, when maintained long enough, begins to calcify. It becomes doctrine. And by the time Mary was born in 1971, there were simply things one did not ask. Her grandfather, Thomas Holbrook, had died in 1954, 2 years before her mother was born. His wife, Iris, had followed in 1982, taking with her whatever stories she had chosen not to tell. What remained were photographs, a family Bible with names inscribed in careful script, and the vague sense, never spoken, that something about Thomas's life had been sad. Mary had always assumed it was grief. After all, his daughter, his only child, had died young. That much was known. Her name was Eleanor. She had been born in 1897 and died in 1931 at the age of 34 of pneumonia. There was a grave. There were records. There was no mystery. Until the photograph. Mary spent the next 3 days searching the attic with a methodical precision she had learned from her years as a librarian. She found more photographs, some labeled, some not. She found Eleanor at 5, at 10, at 17, always the same face, the same dark hair and sharp chin, the same expression of quiet defiance that seemed to run in the family. She found Eleanor's marriage certificate, dated 1919. She found a lock of her hair in an envelope tied with string, but nowhere did she find another photograph of the child from 1903. It was as though that child had been erased or replaced. On the 4th day, Mary drove into town and visited the Broome County Clerk's office. She requested birth records for Eleanor Holbrook, born 1897. The clerk, a young woman with bright red nails and a bored expression, returned 15 minutes later with a single page, photocopied from a ledger. Here you go. Eleanor Jane Holbrook, born March 14, 1897. Parents, Thomas and Iris Holbrook. Nothing unusual. Mary thanked her and left. But in the car, she read the document again, and again. And then she saw it, a faint notation in the margin, barely legible, written in a different hand. Amended. See file 1904. Amended. Mary felt her pulse quicken. She returned to the clerk's office. I need to see the file from 1904, she said. The clerk frowned. What file? There's a notation, right here. Mary pointed. The young woman leaned in, squinting. Then she sighed. That's archive storage. I'll have to request it. Could take a week. I'll wait. It took 9 days. When the call came, Mary drove back to the courthouse with a dread she could not name. The clerk led her to a back room where a single manila folder lay on a metal table, the kind of folder that had been touched so rarely it still had dust in the creases. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a birth certificate for a girl named Clara Dunn, born February 11, 1897, 1 month before Eleanor. Parents, Margaret and Joseph Dunn, both deceased by 1903. Cause of death, typhoid. The second was a petition for adoption, filed by Thomas and Iris Holbrook in April of 1904, requesting legal guardianship of Clara Dunn, age 7. The third was a new birth certificate, issued in May of 1904, renaming Clara Dunn as Eleanor Jane Holbrook. The original date of birth had been altered, March 14, 1897, the same date that appeared in every family record. Mary sat very still. Clara Dunn had been erased, Eleanor Holbrook had been invented, and the child in the 1903 photograph, the child whose face didn't match, had been the first Eleanor, the real Eleanor. Mary Holbrook did not sleep that night. She lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, while her mind traced the edges of a question she did not yet know how to ask. If Clara Dunn had been adopted and renamed Eleanor, then who was the first child? The one in the photograph from 1903? The one her grandparents had called their daughter before Clara arrived? There were only 2 possibilities. Either that child had died and the family had hidden the grief by adopting a replacement, or something far stranger had occurred. By morning, Mary had made a decision. She would find the first Eleanor's grave. Binghamton, New York, in the early 1900s, was a modest city of railroads, factories, and Protestant virtue. Death was common, especially among children, and the dead were buried in churches and municipal cemeteries with bureaucratic efficiency. If the first Eleanor had died between 1903 and 1904, there would be a record. There had to be. Mary began at the Broome County Archives, requesting burial records for children surnamed Holbrook between 1900 and 1910. The archivist, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and the slow, patient demeanor of someone who had read every document in the building at least twice, returned with a ledger bound in cracked leather. "Holbrook," he said, flipping pages. "We've got, let's see, Thomas Holbrook Sr., 1889, Iris Holbrook, 1982, Eleanor Holbrook, 1931, that's all." "No children?" Mary asked. "None listed." "What about stillbirths? Infant deaths?" The man frowned. "Those weren't always recorded, especially if the child wasn't baptized. But if there'd been a funeral, there'd be a church record. You could try the Methodist Archive downtown." Mary thanked him and left. The Methodist Church of Binghamton kept its historical records in a basement that smelled of mildew and old paper. The current pastor, a woman in her 50s named Reverend Calloway, unlocked the door and led Mary down a narrow staircase into a room lined with filing cabinets and cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling. "We've been meaning to digitize this for years," Reverend Calloway said apologetically. "What are you looking for?" "A child's funeral, sometime between 1903 and 1904. Last name Holbrook." The Reverend pulled a box labeled 1900-1905 from a shelf and set it on a folding table. Inside were handwritten logs of baptisms, marriages, and funerals, each entry recorded in the careful script of pastors long dead. Mary scanned the pages slowly. Baptisms, March 1903, June 1903, September 1903. Funerals, April 1903, August 1903, November 1903. And then, January 1904, Eleanor Jane Holbrook, age 6, died January 9th, 1904. Cause of death, drowning. Funeral conducted by Reverend Samuel Grote. Interment, Floral Hill Cemetery. Mary's breath caught. Drowning. She read the entry again, committing every word to memory, then took a photograph with her phone. Reverend Calloway watched quietly, sensing the gravity of whatever Mary had found. "Did you know the family?" the Reverend asked gently. "She was my great-aunt," Mary said. "I didn't know she existed until last week." Floral Hill Cemetery occupied a sloping hillside on the western edge of Binghamton, its oldest graves dating back to the 1850s. Mary arrived just after noon, the sky overcast and heavy with the threat of rain. She stopped at the cemetery office, a small brick building near the entrance, and requested the location of Eleanor Jane Holbrook's grave. The clerk, an elderly man with trembling hands, searched the records and wrote down a plot number on a slip of paper. Section C, row 12, he said. East side of the hill. Mary drove her car as far as the narrow roads allowed, then walked the rest of the way, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass. The graves in Section C were old, many of them tilted or cracked, their inscriptions worn smooth by a century of weather. She found row 12, and then she stopped. There was no gravestone. The plot was there, an unmarked patch of ground, slightly sunken, overgrown with moss and wild grass. No name, no dates, no marker of any kind. Mary knelt in the grass, her hands resting on the earth, and felt the full weight of what her family had done. They had buried a child in silence, and then they had taken her name and given it to someone else. Mary Holbrook returned home that evening with a single question burning in her mind. Why? Why would a family erase the death of their own child? Why replace her, not just emotionally, but legally, bureaucratically, erasing even her name from the record? Grief could explain adoption, but this was something else. This was concealment. She spread the documents across her kitchen table, the photograph from 1903, the adoption papers, the church funeral log, the amended birth certificate. She arranged them chronologically, as though assembling evidence for a trial. 1897. Eleanor Jane Holbrook is born. 1903. A photograph is taken of Thomas Holbrook holding his daughter. The child is approximately 6 years old. January 1904. Eleanor Jane Holbrook dies by drowning. She is buried without a headstone. April 1904. Thomas and Iris Holbrook adopt Clara Dunn, age 7, orphaned after her parents' death. May 1904. Clara Dunn is legally renamed Eleanor Jane Holbrook. Her birth date is altered to match the deceased child's. Mary stared at the timeline. There was no gap, no ambiguity. The sequence was deliberate. The first Eleanor had died, and within 4 months, she had been replaced, not metaphorically, but literally. A new child with a new face had been inserted into the family as though the first had never existed. But why Clara Dunn? Why a child who looked nothing like the daughter they had lost? Mary opened her laptop and began searching genealogical databases. She found Clara Dunn's parents easily, Margaret and Joseph Dunn, Irish immigrants who had settled in Binghamton in the 1880s. Joseph had worked as a laborer for the railroad. Margaret had taken in laundry. They had died within 2 weeks of each other in the summer of 1903, leaving Clara orphaned. She had been placed in the care of the Broome County Orphan Asylum, a grim institution on the outskirts of town that had since been demolished. Mary found a digitized record from the asylum's intake log. Clara Dunn, age 6, admitted July 14, 1903. Parents deceased. No known relatives. Quiet disposition. No behavioral issues. And then, 9 months later, Clara had been adopted by the Holbrooks. Mary leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. There was no family connection between the Holbrooks and the Dunns. No prior relationship. So why had Thomas and Iris chosen Clara? Had they visited the orphanage looking for a replacement child and simply selected her? Or had there been something else, some reason Clara, specifically, had been chosen? Mary opened the photograph from 1903 again, zooming in on the first Eleanor's face. Dark eyes, pale skin, a small, solemn mouth. She looked fragile, almost ghostly, even in the faded sepia tones of the image. Then Mary pulled up the only photograph she had of Clara, taken years later, in 1920, when Clara, now legally Eleanor, was a young woman. The face was different, broader, stronger, with a slightly crooked smile and a directness in the gaze that suggested a survivor's resilience. They didn't look alike. But they had been made to carry the same name, the same birthday, the same identity. If you've made it this far, you're already invested in this mystery. Leave a comment with this sentence. Some identities are borrowed, not born. I want to know who's still with me. Mary closed her laptop and walked to the window. Outside, the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. And for the first time since finding the photograph, Mary felt not curiosity, but fear. Because the more she uncovered, the more it seemed that her family had not simply hidden a tragedy. They had committed an act of historical erasure so complete, so deliberate, that even the earth above Eleanor's grave had been left blank. And she did not yet know why. Mary Holbrook spent the next week submerged in archives, libraries, and online genealogical databases, driven by a compulsion she could not name. She was no longer looking for answers. She was looking for witnesses. Someone, somewhere, must have known what happened to the first Eleanor. Someone must have questioned the sudden appearance of a new child in the Holbrook household. Someone must have remembered. She began with neighbors. The 1910 United States Census listed the Holbrook family as living on a rural property just outside Binghamton, on a road that was now paved and lined with strip malls but had once been farmland. Using property records, Mary identified the families who had lived nearby during that period: the Caldwells, the Merricks, the Van Horns. Most of those families were gone, their descendants scattered across the country. But Mary found one lead, a woman named Judith Merrick Caldwell, age 92, living in a nursing home in Syracuse. According to genealogical records, Judith was the granddaughter of the Merricks, neighbors of the Holbrooks in the early 1900s. Mary called the nursing home and, after some negotiation, was granted a brief visit. Judith Merrick Caldwell sat in a wheelchair by the window of her small room, a crocheted blanket across her lap, her eyes sharp despite her age. Mary introduced herself and explained as gently as possible that she was researching her family's history. "Holbrook," Judith said slowly, as though tasting the name. "Yes. I remember stories about them. My grandmother used to talk about Thomas Holbrook. Said he was a hard man. Quiet. Kept to himself after the accident." "The accident?" Mary leaned forward. Judith nodded. "The girl drowned. In the pond on their property. Winter of 1904, I think. My grandmother said it was a terrible thing. They found her under the ice." Mary's chest tightened. "Do you know how it happened?" No one really knew. The girl had gone out to play, they said. The pond wasn't supposed to freeze that thick. It was a warm winter. But she went through. By the time they found her, it was too late. Judith paused, her gaze distant. "My grandmother said Thomas was never the same after. He stopped coming to church, stopped talking to people. And then, a few months later, there was a new girl." "Clara," Mary said quietly. Judith blinked. "I don't know her name. But yes, there was a new girl. People talked about it. Some said it was wrong, trying to replace a child like that. Others said it was grief, that people do strange things when they're broken. But my grandmother said something else." "What?" Judith's voice dropped, as though sharing a confidence. "She said the new girl looked scared, like she didn't want to be there." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. That night, Mary returned to the documents, but now she was looking for something specific. Evidence of trauma. She searched Clara Dunn's orphanage records again, looking for any notes on her behavior, her health, her state of mind. She found a single entry, dated March 1904. "Clara Dunn removed from general dormitory and placed in isolation room following incident. Child attempted to leave premises without permission. Stated she didn't want to go with them. Supervisor noted, uncooperative but not violent. Adoption proceedings continued without delay. Mary read the entry 3 times. Clara had tried to run away. She hadn't wanted to be adopted by the Holbrooks. Mary sat back, her mind reeling. What had Clara known? Had she been told she was replacing a dead child? Had she understood what was being asked of her, to take someone else's name, someone else's life? Or had she simply sensed, in the way children sometimes do, that something was wrong? Mary returned to Floral Hill Cemetery the next morning, this time bringing a small spade, gloves, and a bag of wildflower seeds. She knelt beside the unmarked grave and began to dig gently around the edges, not to disturb the earth but to define it, to give the space shape and acknowledgement. As she worked, she spoke aloud, as though the first Eleanor could hear her. "I don't know why they did this to you. I don't know if it was shame or grief or something else. But I'm here now. And I'm going to make sure people know you existed." When she finished, she planted the wildflowers in a careful circle around the plot, pressing the soil down with her hands. It wasn't a headstone, but it was something. As she stood to leave, an older man approached, the same cemetery clerk from before. He had been watching from a distance. "You found her then," he said. Mary nodded. The man was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something you should know. When I looked up that plot earlier, I saw a note in the records. It said the burial was conducted at night. No service, just the gravedigger and the father." "At night?" Mary's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, it's unusual. Most burials back then were done in daylight, with family present. But this one, it was like they didn't want anyone to see." Mary felt the air leave her lungs. The man nodded slowly. "Thought you should know." Mary Holbrook could not let it go. The image of Thomas Holbrook standing beside an unmarked grave in the middle of the night, alone except for a gravedigger, had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. It spoke not of grief, but of secrecy, of something that needed to be hidden even from the eyes of mourners. She needed to know what had really happened to the first Eleanor. She returned to the Broome County Archives and requested coroner's reports from January 1904. The archivist, the same older man with wire-rimmed glasses, disappeared into the stacks and returned 20 minutes later with a leather-bound volume labeled Inquest Records, 1903-1905. Coroner's inquests were mandatory for any death deemed suspicious or accidental, he explained, setting the book on the table. If the girl drowned, there should be a report. Mary opened the book carefully, turning pages until she found the entry dated January 10th, 1904, one day after Eleanor's death. Inquest into the death of Eleanor Jane Holbrook, age 6, daughter of Thomas and Iris Holbrook. Cause of death, accidental drowning. Body recovered from pond on family property. No witnesses. Coroner's ruling, accidental death. No further investigation required. Mary read the entry twice, then frowned. The language was perfunctory, almost dismissive. There were no details, no description of injuries, no interview notes, no mention of how long Eleanor had been in the water or what she had been wearing. For a child's death, it was strangely brief. She turned the page, hoping for more, and found something unexpected. A handwritten note in the margin, added later in a different ink. Dr. Whitmore declined to sign final report. Matter closed by county order. Mary's pulse quickened. She copied the note into her phone, then asked the archivist if there were any other records related to Dr. Whitmore. "Whitmore," the man murmured, thinking. "That name sounds familiar. Let me check the physician registry." He returned with a slim directory from 1905, listing all licensed doctors in Broome County. Mary found the entry immediately. Dr. Harold Whitmore, MD General Practice and Forensic Medicine. Office 47 Main Street, Binghamton. Resigned from County Coroner Service 1904. Reason? Personal. Resigned. The same year Eleanor died. Mary leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. A coroner refuses to sign a death report, then resigns from his position. The case is closed anyway, by county order. A child is buried at night, without ceremony, in an unmarked grave. And within 4 months, a replacement child is installed in the family, given the dead girl's name and birth date, as though the first Eleanor had never existed. This was not grief. This was a cover-up. But of what? Mary spent the next 3 days searching for anything related to Dr. Harold Whitmore. She found his obituary in a 1921 newspaper. Dr. Harold Whitmore, 68, passed away peacefully at his home. He is survived by his wife, Margaret, and 2 sons. Services will be held at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. The obituary mentioned nothing about his resignation, nothing about Eleanor Holbrook. But Mary noticed something else. Dr. Whitmore's wife, Margaret, had lived until 1954, and she had kept a personal archive, medical journals, correspondence, and notes that had been donated to the Binghamton Historical Society after her death. Mary drove to the Historical Society that same afternoon. The Whitmore collection occupied 3 archive boxes in the Society's climate-controlled storage room. Mary requested all 3 and spent the next 4 hours combing through letters, appointment books, and handwritten medical observations. Most of it was mundane: patient notes, prescriptions, commentary on public health issues of the era. But in the second box, buried beneath a stack of medical journals from 1903, Mary found a leather-bound notebook labeled Private Case Notes, not for publication. She opened it carefully. The entries were dated and organized by case. Mary scanned the pages until she found January 1904, and there it was. January 10th, 1904. Conducted post-mortem examination of female child, age approximately 6 years, at request of Broome County Sheriff. Body recovered from pond on Holbrook property. Preliminary findings inconsistent with accidental drowning. Mary's hands began to shake. She read on. No water in lungs. Lividity pattern suggests body was submerged post-mortem. Bruising on neck and shoulders consistent with manual restraint. Cause of death likely asphyxiation, not drowning. Recommended further investigation. Request denied by Sheriff Dornan. Case ordered closed. I have declined to sign the final report. Mary sat frozen, the notebook open on her lap. Eleanor had not drowned. She had been killed. And someone, Sheriff Dornan, the county, perhaps even Thomas Holbrook himself, had made sure no one would ever know. Mary Holbrook sat in her car outside the Historical Society, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. The words from Dr. Whitmore's private notebook repeated in her mind like a chant. Bruising on neck and shoulders. Asphyxiation. Not drowning. Eleanor had been murdered, and her father had buried her in the dark. Mary did not know if Thomas Holbrook had killed his daughter himself or if he had simply covered for someone else. But the sequence of events, the rushed burial, the falsified coroner's report, the immediate adoption of a replacement child, pointed to a single horrifying conclusion. Eleanor's death had been intentional, and the family had conspired to erase it. But why Clara? Why adopt a child who looked nothing like the daughter they had lost? Why not simply move on, as so many grieving families did? The answer, Mary realized, lay not in sentiment, but in law. She returned home and began researching inheritance and property law in early 20th century New York. What she found confirmed her suspicion. Under the legal codes of that time, a man's estate passed first to his children, then to his wife. If Thomas and Iris Holbrook had no heir, Thomas's property, land, money, possessions, would have been subject to complex probate proceedings upon his death. But if they had a daughter, the inheritance would pass cleanly, without question. Eleanor had not been replaced out of love. She had been replaced to preserve the estate. Clara Dunn had been adopted not as a daughter, but as a legal instrument, a living placeholder to ensure the Holbrook property remained within the family. And Clara, Mary thought, must have known, or at least suspected. That was why she had tried to run away from the orphanage. That was why, according to Judith Merrick Caldwell's grandmother, she had looked scared, because she had understood on some instinctive level that she was being used. Mary spent the next week writing everything down: the timeline, the documents, the interviews, the evidence from Dr. Whitmore's notes. She compiled it all into a single file and contacted a historian at Cornell University who specialized in 19th and early 20th century criminal justice in upstate New York. The historian, Dr. Alan Cross, agreed to review the materials. 2 days later, he called. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Cross said, his voice low with something like reverence. "You've uncovered what amounts to a coordinated suppression of evidence by local authorities. Sheriff Dornan, the coroner's office, possibly even the county clerk, all of them complicit in burying a child's murder. The question is why?" "I think Thomas Holbrook had influence," Mary said. Maybe money, maybe connections, enough to make this go away. Possibly, Dr. Cross agreed. But there's another explanation. In rural communities at that time, family reputation was everything. A child's death by violence, especially if the father was involved, would have destroyed the Holbrook name. The authorities may have decided it was easier to look the other way. Mary closed her eyes. So they let him bury her. And then they let him erase her. Yes. There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Dr. Cross spoke again. What are you going to do with this? Mary didn't hesitate. I'm going to tell the truth. Mary Holbrook published her findings in a regional history journal, then shared them with local newspapers and genealogical societies. The story spread quickly, not because it was sensational, but because it was meticulous. Every claim was supported by documents. Every conclusion was drawn from evidence. It was not a conspiracy theory. It was history. Within weeks, the story reached the Binghamton City Council. A motion was introduced to formally acknowledge the unmarked grave in Floral Hill Cemetery and to install a memorial plaque in Eleanor Jane Holbrook's name, the first Eleanor, the forgotten one. The motion passed unanimously. On a cold morning in October 2020, Mary stood beside the grave as a small stone marker was placed into the ground. It read, Eleanor Jane Holbrook, 1897-1904. Remembered a handful of people attended. A few members of the Historical Society, Dr. Cross from Cornell, Reverend Calloway from the Methodist Church, and Judith Merrick Caldwell, who had traveled from Syracuse in a wheelchair to bear witness. No one from the Holbrook family came. Mary was the only descendant present. As the ceremony ended, Mary knelt beside the grave and placed a single white rose on the stone. I'm sorry it took so long, she whispered. And for the first time since finding the photograph, she felt the weight lift, just slightly. That night, Mary sat at her kitchen table and opened the photograph from 1903 one last time. She looked at Thomas Holbrook's face, stern and unreadable, and at the small girl in his arms, staring into the camera with wide, solemn eyes. She wondered if Eleanor had known in those final moments what was coming, if she had cried out, if she had struggled, if she had hoped for rescue. And she wondered if Clara, renamed Eleanor, forced to live someone else's life, had ever forgiven them. Mary placed the photograph in an archival sleeve and filed it carefully in a box marked Family History, Resolved. Then she closed the box and turned off the light. Some stories, she thought, are not meant to be forgotten. They are meant to be remembered, not as tragedy alone, but as evidence that silence, no matter how carefully maintained, will always break. And truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always rise. If you've made it this far, it's because this story mattered to you. Leave a comment saying, I've watched this far, so I can see who truly values these forgotten histories. And if you believe that truth deserves to be remembered, subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because history doesn't preserve itself. We do. What state or city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Until the next story, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions. The memorial plaque had been in the ground for 3 months when Mary received the letter. It arrived in a plain manila envelope, postmarked from Portland, Oregon, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in shaky cursive, and a photograph, old, sepia-toned, cracked along the edges. Mary unfolded the letter and read, Dear Ms. Holbrook, my name is Catherine Wells. I am 87 years old. I saw the article about Eleanor Holbrook in the historical journal my granddaughter subscribes to. I don't know if this matters anymore, but I think you should know. My grandmother was Clara Dunn. Mary's breath caught. She read on. I never knew the full story until I was much older. My grandmother rarely spoke about her childhood. But before she died in 1976, she told me something I've never repeated to anyone. She said that when she was 7 years old, she was taken from an orphanage and brought to a house in the country. She said the people who adopted her were kind at first, but distant, She said they called her by a name that wasn't hers. She said they made her memorize a birth date that was wrong, and she said, the handwriting wavered here as though the writer had paused to steady herself. She said there was a pond on the property, and that she was never allowed to go near it. She said the woman, Iris, told her once that the first girl had drowned there, and that Clara should never, ever go near the water. My grandmother said she spent her entire childhood terrified of that pond. She said she could feel something under the ice, even in summer. Mary's hands trembled as she continued. I thought she was just remembering childhood fears. But after reading your article, I realized she was telling the truth. She knew what had happened. Maybe not all of it, but enough to be afraid. I'm enclosing a photograph my grandmother kept hidden in a jewelry box. She never explained it to me. Maybe you'll understand. Sincerely, Catherine Wells. Mary set the letter down and picked up the photograph. It was Clara. Mary recognized her face from later pictures. But this photograph was early, perhaps from 1905 or 1906. Clara stood in front of a white farmhouse, wearing a plain dress, her arms at her sides, her expression blank. But it wasn't Clara that made Mary's heart stop. It was the window behind her. The memorial plaque had been in the ground for 3 months when Mary received the letter. It arrived in a plain manila envelope, postmarked from Portland, Oregon, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in shaky cursive, and a photograph, old, sepia-toned, cracked along the edges. Mary unfolded the letter and read, Dear Ms. Holbrook, my name is Catherine Wells. I am 87 years old. I saw the article about Eleanor Holbrook in the historical journal my granddaughter subscribes to. I don't know if this matters anymore, but I think you should know. My grandmother was Clara Dunn. Mary's breath caught. She read on. I never knew the full story until I was much older. My grandmother rarely spoke about her childhood. But before she died in 1976, she told me something I've never repeated to anyone. She said that when she was 7 years old, she was taken from an orphanage and brought to a house in the country. She said the people who adopted her were kind at first, but distant. She said they called her by a name that wasn't hers. She said they made her memorize a birth date that was wrong. The handwriting wavered here, as though the writer had paused to steady herself. She told me she spent years trying to remember who she really was. She said Iris would correct her whenever she used her real name, until eventually Clara stopped saying it altogether. She said she learned to become Eleanor, not because she wanted to, but because there was no other choice. She survived by forgetting herself. Mary felt tears sting her eyes. My grandmother married in 1919 and moved away as soon as she could. She never went back to that house. She never spoke to Thomas or Iris again. When they died, she didn't attend the funerals. I asked her once why she hated them so much. She just said, they took everything from me, even my name. I'm writing to you because I want you to know that Clara, my grandmother, was a good woman. She raised 4 children. She volunteered at her church. She lived a full life. But I don't think she was ever truly happy. I think she carried that sadness with her until the day she died. Thank you for remembering Eleanor. Both of them. Sincerely, Catherine Wells. Mary sat at her kitchen table, the letter in her hands, and wept. She wept for Eleanor, who had died in violence and been buried in silence. She wept for Clara, who had survived but lost herself in the process. And she wept for all the ways families destroy each other in the name of preservation. She carefully placed the letter in her archive box, alongside the photograph from 1903 and all the documents she had gathered. Then she called Catherine Wells. The conversation lasted an hour. Catherine spoke about her grandmother's life after leaving the Holbrook house, the children she raised, the garden she kept, the quilts she made. She spoke about how Clara had never owned a mirror in her bedroom, how she avoided photographs whenever possible, how she seemed most at peace when she was alone. She told me once, Catherine said quietly, that she spent her whole life trying to figure out who she would have been if they hadn't renamed her. She said it was like living with a ghost inside her, someone else's identity that she could never fully shed. Mary closed her eyes, absorbing the weight of those words. Thank you for telling me, she said. Clara deserved to be remembered too. Not as Eleanor's replacement, but as herself. "That's why I wrote to you," Catherine said. "Because you're the first person who's ever tried to separate them. The first person who saw that there were two girls, not just one." After they hung up, Mary sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen and thought about identity. How fragile it is, how easily it can be taken, how desperately we cling to it even when the world insists we become someone else. And she thought about the mirror that had started everything. The moment she had held that photograph up and realized the face didn't match. Because that's what this story had always been about. The gap between who we are and who we're forced to become. The space between the face in our hands and the face in the glass. Mary Holbrook returned to Floral Hill Cemetery one final time in the spring of 2021. The wildflowers she had planted around Eleanor's grave had bloomed, delicate purple and yellow blossoms that swayed in the breeze. She stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but bearing witness, acknowledging, remembering. And then she did something she hadn't planned. She took out her phone and recorded a short video. In it, she explained the story, not the academic version from the historical journal, but the human one. She talked about two girls, one who died too young, one who lived too long as someone else. She talked about silence and erasure and the cost of family secrets. She posted the video on social media with a simple caption. "Some truths take a century to surface, but they always do." Within a week, the video had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from people who had discovered similar stories in their own families, children erased, identities stolen, histories rewritten. The story of Eleanor and Clara became a symbol for a larger truth, that the past is never as settled as we think, and that every family has shadows it would rather not face. A documentary filmmaker reached out to Mary, asking if she would participate in a project about hidden family histories. A university invited her to speak about genealogical research and historical justice. A publisher expressed interest in a book. But Mary turned them all down. "This isn't about me," she told the filmmaker. "It's about them, and I've said what needed to be said." Instead, she focused on something smaller but more meaningful. She worked with the Binghamton Historical Society to create a digital archive of her research, making it freely available to anyone who wanted to learn from it. She included scans of every document, photographs of Eleanor's grave, transcripts of her interviews, and she wrote a detailed account of Clara's life after 1904, not as Eleanor Holbrook, but as the girl who had survived the erasure and built a life despite it. The archive went live in June 2021, and within days, Mary received dozens of messages from descendants of other families who had known the Holbrooks. Some shared their own memories, some offered condolences. Some simply thanked her for not letting the story die. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Sarah Holbrook Chen, a distant cousin Mary had never met. "Dear Mary, I grew up hearing whispers about the tragedy in our family, but no one would ever explain what it meant. Now I understand. Thank you for having the courage to uncover this. It doesn't change the past, but it gives us a chance to face it honestly. I'm driving to Binghamton next month. Would you meet me at the cemetery? I'd like to see Eleanor's grave." With gratitude, Sarah Mary agreed. On a warm afternoon in July, Mary and Sarah stood together beside the small stone marker. Sarah placed a bouquet of white roses on the grave, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. Finally, Sarah said, "Do you think Clara ever forgave them?" Mary considered the question. "I don't know, but I think she survived them, and maybe that's enough." Sarah nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about my own daughter. She's 8, the same age Clara was when this happened. I can't imagine—" Her voice broke. "I can't imagine doing that to a child." "Neither can I," Mary said quietly. "But people do terrible things when they're afraid. Afraid of scandal, afraid of losing status, afraid of the truth. Do you think Thomas killed Eleanor himself?" Mary had asked herself that question 1,000 times. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he knew who did and chose to protect them. Either way, he made the choice to bury her in silence." and that's unforgivable. They stood together for a while longer, then walked slowly back toward the cemetery gates. As they reached the parking lot, Sarah turned to Mary. "What will you do now?" Mary smiled faintly. "I'm going to keep researching. There are other stories out there, other families, other silences. Someone has to remember." "Then I hope you find them," Sarah said. "And I hope you tell them." They embraced briefly, and then Sarah drove away. Mary stood alone in the cemetery parking lot, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. The light was golden, soft, the kind of light that makes everything look gentler than it is. She thought about Eleanor, 6 years old. Her life ended before it had truly begun. She thought about Clara, 7 years old, her identity stolen and replaced. She thought about all the women and children whose stories had been buried by men who valued reputation over truth, legacy over love. And she thought about the photograph, the one that had started everything, a father holding his daughter, a face that didn't match. Mary had spent more than a year searching for answers. She had uncovered a murder, exposed a cover-up, and given a name back to a girl who had been erased. But the question that haunted her most was the simplest one. Why? Why had Thomas Holbrook done it? Was it shame? Greed? Fear? She would never know for certain. The only people who could have answered were long dead. But perhaps, she thought, that was the point. Some questions don't have answers. Some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries. Not because the truth doesn't exist, but because the people who held it chose silence over honesty. And now, a century later, all that remained were fragments. A photograph, a grave, a name on a stone, and the knowledge that someone finally had cared enough to remember. Mary took one last look at the cemetery, then got into her car and drove home. If you've made it this far, it's because this story mattered to you. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can see who truly values these forgotten histories. And if you believe that truth deserves to be remembered, subscribe to this channel, because history doesn't preserve itself. We do. Hit the like button if this story moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, because every silence broken is a step toward justice. What state or city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Until the next story, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop asking questions. Some identities are borrowed, not born. But the truth always belongs to those brave enough to seek it.